A Russian man claiming to hold top-level secrets about Russian advanced bombers has just turned up at the U.S. southern border, seeking asylum. The man claims to have been an engineer at a production facility over in the city of Kazan, and he says that he possesses top-secret information about the White Swan Tu-160, which is the most advanced bomber in the Russian arsenal. U.S. border officials, they interviewed the man, and they determined that his story was in fact credible and eventually passed him off to the FBI, who are still in the process of interrogating him right now. However, analysts have pointed out that the fact that the story was even leaked to the public is an indication that perhaps the American government is encouraging other Russians who also hold top-level secrets to also escape to America. And if you thought that was interesting, well then you should click on that button below this video and check out Epic TV, one of the best no-censorship video platforms on the internet.
Let me call the hearing to order and welcome Ranking Member Grassley and our witnesses and guests to our 7th committee hearing. Today we will continue our series on the economic costs of climate change, costs that are already affecting workers, families, and governments across the country. Today we explore the climate harms to public health and the associated economic and budgetary burdens. As we've heard throughout this series, the climate crisis brings with it what witnesses have repeatedly called systemic risks, ones that cascade beyond a particular troubled sector to harm the entire economy and pose serious threats to the federal budget. Their warnings aren't for future lawmakers, they're for us in this room to protect against. Healthcare costs related to combustion of fossil fuels have been estimated to total nearly $820 billion in the United States annually. Over the 10-year budget window, that's over $8 trillion. The direct costs of healthcare, doctor's appointments, emergency room visits, rehabilitation and home health support, prescription drugs, strain the pocketbooks of American families. The indirect economic costs from lost work and school days, reduced productivity, and increased economic instability all add to that $8 trillion budgetary burden. If you care about deficits or economic growth, you have to care about climate change and its costs and risks. Yet, with evidence of the economic dangers of climate change piling up around us, House Republicans propose eliminating clean energy tax credits and investments. They have completely lost their grip on reality and are so subservient to fossil fuel overlords that they're willing to eliminate hundreds of thousands of clean energy jobs, cause trillions in climate harm, and shrink our economy by letting China build the technologies of tomorrow. Their non-starter of a default plan would escalate carbon pollution, raising temperatures around the world. In Rhode Island in the last century, the average temperature is up 3 degrees. Rhode Island emergency rooms see a rise in hospital visits anytime there are multiple 80-plus degree days in a row. On average, there are 702 heat-related deaths and over 67,000 emergency room visits each year in America due to heat. Extreme temperatures are more frequent and severe, and that costs lives and dollars. The Pacific Northwest's deadly heat wave in 2021 saw approximately 600 additional deaths in 1 week in Oregon and Washington state. A heat wave of that intensity would have been virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. Higher temperatures also encourage smog formation and contribute to higher levels of airborne particulate matter and pollen. The combination of heat and poor air quality increases cardiovascular and respiratory risk and the likelihood and severity of asthma attacks. Warming climates expand disease vectors northward, particularly insects that carry diseases like Lyme disease, West Nile virus, dengue fever, and Zika. Indeed, there is evidence that climate shifts are the driving force behind more frequent disease outbreaks. Climate upheaval brings more frequent and extreme weather events, which bring their own healthcare costs. The news reports regularly how hurricanes, wildfires, floods, and droughts lead to death, injury, and illness. Hurricane Sandy is estimated to have cost $3.3 billion in health costs, including nearly 4,700 emergency room visits, over 6,600 hospital admissions, and 273 deaths. The public health harms from climate change fall most heavily on the elderly, on children, on people of color, on the poor, and on people with pre-existing conditions. Climate change is a multiplier, both of illness rates and economic disparities. As a result, it will worsen economic inequality and widen gaps in health outcomes and life expectancy between poor and wealthy. Federal programs like Medicare and Medicaid will be heavily impacted given the populations they serve. In 2021, Medicare and Medicaid constituted almost 40% of all U.S. healthcare spending and almost 20% of all federal spending. Of course, these climate-related healthcare costs come on top of the many other climate costs we've heard about at previous hearings. Witnesses have warned us of risks that could take down the economy: the risk of a coastal property values crash, the risk of a similar wipeout in property values in wildfire country, the risk of insurance collapse as unpredictability drives insurers out of markets, the risk of the carbon bubble bursting in a disorderly transition from fossil fuel. These are not alternative scenarios. They all could happen. We're playing with dangerous stakes. The consulting firm Deloitte has pegged the difference between getting climate right and getting it wrong at a more than $220 trillion swing. In a world in which those long warned of evils have come to pass, the $8 trillion healthcare cost burden will likely grow as a crashed economy and budget will shrink, not a good combination. As this hearing makes clear, the effects of climate crisis on our nation's public health are dangerous and costly to families, to businesses, and to the federal government. And this problem will only get worse and become more expensive unless we act now. I turn now to our distinguished ranking member, Senator Grassley.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Mr. Chairman, I want you to know that last week's hearing on tax policy was really refreshing. Revenues are a critical part of the federal budget, and we should remain very focused on the pressing fiscal issues facing our country. Our Republican colleagues in the other body introduced legislation to lift the debt ceiling and curb our federal spending this week. I don't agree with every item in the bill. In fact, I haven't read only excerpts of it, but things are clear. America's fiscal problems are serious, and Republicans are working to tackle those problems head on. The U.S. is facing public debt that in a few years will surpass record levels set in the wake of World War II. Even if we don't agree with all the contents of the House bill, Republicans are following through with concrete solutions to address our dire fiscal situation and to reduce inflation. It's been 88 years since President Biden and Speaker McCarthy met down at the White House as an initial meeting to deal with these issues. No meeting has taken place since then. So I see President Biden refusing to even enter a negotiation room with Speaker McCarthy. Senate Democrats haven't lifted a finger to prevent us from going headlong off the fiscal cliff. The Budget Committee is currently holding its sixth hearing on climate change. Let's now work together to write a budget that has guardrails to rein in federal spending. I have a reputation for traveling each of the 99 counties, holding a Q&A with my constituents in each of those counties, 42 years in a row, 28 counties so far this year. Not every Iowan agrees with every decision I make as a senator, but I'm always willing to have a conversation about the topics that matter most to them and our country. Healthcare concerns often come up. Now, however, the health effects of climate change isn't one that I've heard much, if at all. Our government healthcare programs, including Medicare, Medicaid, and public health, are projected to spend $21 trillion over the next 10 years. I do hear a lot from my constituents about preserving Medicare, and I agree that we should be doing that. We need to ensure that these taxpayers' funds that we call Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid are used wisely to address pressing health issues facing Americans, and we should be doing that right now. If members are really interested in a bipartisan conversation about public health challenges and healthcare financing, I'd suggest that we focus on the key health challenges facing Americans right now, and some of these are the 107,000 Americans that die from drug overdose, particular fentanyl, killing 70,000 of that 107,000. How to lower prescription drug costs so patients don't delay treatment and save money, how to improve access to rural health care as hospitals and clinics are struggling to stay afloat, and how to address the leading cause of death in America, which happens to be heart disease. We have significant health care challenges right now. A climate change mandate from Washington, D.C. won't solve the public health and healthcare finances challenging that we face this very day. I look forward to hearing testimony of Mr. Schellenberger. He was invited to serve as an expert reviewer by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He's also been recognized by Time magazine as, quote unquote, a hero of the environment. The majority argues that climate change will catastrophically lead to more heat-related illnesses and deaths. They argue it will dramatically amplify global disease, damage respiratory health, and harm 4 Americans from natural disasters. I'm confident that Mr. Schellenberger will be able to separate their alarm from reality. Dr. Schramm, I also welcome you back to the committee. You remember when the Budget Committee focused on budgetary matters. You testified as a witness on the Reagan administration budget proposal for 1983. That year, the committee held 6 hearings in 1 month as we prepared a budget resolution. And when Reagan and Tip O'Neill got together in 1983 to solve that problem, I doubt if they thought that they were doing it for a whole half century, but it works out that Social Security won't run out of surplus money until 2033. Then afterwards, we're in a crisis because people will only be getting 77% of what they're getting right now. Dr. Schramm, you founded the nation's first research organization dedicated to understanding healthcare financing, and I'm interested in exploring your current work to ensure our public health institutions focus on their core mission where they've been failing. I yield.
Thank you. We have 5 witnesses today, including a witness from Maryland, who will be introduced by Senator Van Hollen. I want to thank Delegate Stephanie Smith for being here and turn to Senator Van Hollen for his introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Grassley. Welcome to all our witnesses today. I have the special honor of being able to introduce a colleague and friend from the state of Maryland, Delegate Stephanie Smith, who's a member of the Maryland House of Delegates representing District 45. Delegate Smith was just reelected to serve a second term representing a part of Baltimore City. She serves on the Maryland House Appropriations Committee and chairs the Education and Economic Development Subcommittee. She's also the chair of the Baltimore City delegation in Annapolis. And I congratulate her on wrapping up a very successful 90-day session. But Delegate Smith is here not only because she's a skilled legislator, but more important for today's purposes, she's a federal policy expert and an advocate on many of the issues that the committee will cover today, especially her understanding and knowledge of the negative health impacts that climate change will have broadly, but especially in American cities, and especially the rising healthcare costs due to urban heat. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for inviting her to be with us today. I look forward to returning to try to ask questions of both Delegate Smith and other members of the panel. But welcome and thank you, Mr. Chairman and members for inviting a very important witness today.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen, and thank you, Delegate Smith. Our other witnesses are Dr. Caitlin Moretti. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine at Brown University and a board-certified emergency medicine physician practicing in Providence, Rhode Island. She founded and co-chairs the Rhode Island Medical Society's Climate Change and Health Committee. We look forward to her testimony and her unique perspective as an emergency medicine physician. Next, we have Dr. Michael Greenstone, who is the Milton Friedman Distinguished Service Professor in Economics, as well as the director of the Becker-Friedman Institute and the director of the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on uncovering the benefits and costs of environmental quality and society's energy choices. Dr. Greenstone, thank you for being here. We look forward to your testimony. Next, we have Dr. Carl Schramm, who is a university professor in the School of Information Studies at Syracuse University. He previously served on the faculty of the Johns Hopkins School of Hygiene and Public Health, where he focused on public policy in hospital finance. Additionally, he has founded and co-founded several companies in healthcare finance and information technology. We welcome him and look forward to his testimony. Finally, we'll hear from Michael Schellenberger, who is the founder and president of Environmental Progress. He is also the co-founder of the Breakthrough Institute, where he served as president from 2003 to 2015. We welcome him as well. Delegate Smith, you have 5 minutes to deliver your testimony. Your full statement will be made a part of the official record. Please proceed.
Good morning. I'm Chairman Whitehouse. Also, good morning, Ranking Member Grassley, and to all the distinguished members of the committee. For the record, I'm Delegate Stephanie Smith. I proudly represent Maryland's 45th State Legislative District in Baltimore City. And as you heard from my great Senator Van Hollen, I am honored to serve on the Appropriations Committee and also chair the Baltimore City House delegation. But outside of my work as a legislator, I've spent my career for nearly 2 decades at the intersection of environmental health, urban planning, and community development. And today I will share observations about the public health costs of climate change, and that will come from both my professional lens as well as the lived experiences of my neighbors. Baltimore's average temperature has risen 3 degrees over the last century, nearly twice as much as the nation at large. And beyond overall increases in average temperature, Baltimore is one of the leading U.S. cities for the urban heat island effect. Urban heat islands are hyperlocal pockets of elevated temperatures within a city that can exacerbate adverse health outcomes for residents with diabetes, cardiovascular conditions, and respiratory health challenges, just to name a few. A concentration of paved surfaces, buildings, and industrial activities amplify rising temperatures. And Baltimore's urban heat islands make our city the 9th hottest urban hot zone in the United States. Residents inside Baltimore's urban heat islands are more likely to be people of color, low income, and live shorter lives. My district is home to landmarks like Pennsylvania Station and Johns Hopkins Medical Center, as well as communities that have faced the policy harm of redlining and disinvestment. The top of my district boasts mature trees and significant green spaces like Herring Run Park. However, I live at the bottom of my district in East Baltimore, which is home to dense row home communities with the hottest temperatures in Baltimore City. As climate change delivers more extreme heat days, Baltimore is on pace to see a 6-fold increase in these very hot days in the next 15 years. In East Baltimore, communities like Madison East End and McKeldrey Park, this can mean more emergency medical calls for chronic conditions. As the heat index approaches 103 degrees, emergency calls for congestive heart failure can double. I personally live in a 123-year-old rehabbed row home with my husband, my young children, and my mother who has a chronic heart condition. Thankfully, our home has central air conditioning that can maintain her comfort on the hottest days. All of my neighbors deserve to live with the dignity and the baseline resilience needed to survive extreme heat. Unfortunately, news reports have detailed some of the difficulties my neighbors face as extreme heat days multiply. In July 2019, the University of Maryland put sensors inside of McKeldrey Park homes and recorded interior temperatures as high as 97 degrees with a heat index of 119 degrees. Parents are keeping children confined in hot homes or do not install window air conditioning units on the first floor due to concerns about public safety. Tammy Jackson, a resident of McKeldrey Park, lamented, "The interior temperature was 92 degrees on a 100-degree day." With asthmatic grandchildren, Jackson doesn't know where to find relief. She simply exclaimed, "This is too much. Lord, this is too much." Yes, the scope of this challenge can feel like it's too much, but I do have good news to share. While climate change continues to increase temperatures, there are investments that we can make at every level of government, including increasing the urban tree canopy, prioritizing green roofs and surfaces and construction, providing more accessibility to cooling centers, and proactively reaching out to our most vulnerable community members during Code Red days. While this problem is enormous, mitigating adverse health impacts of extreme heat can mean cost savings from reduced Medicaid claims, reduced emergency medical care for the uninsured, and increased economic productivity from improved healthiness. The state of Maryland, through our Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022, invested in 5 million urban tree plantings and encouraged green infrastructure. But we will need local, state, and federal strategies and investments to blunt the aggressive harm extreme heat poses to urban centers. I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak today and to lift up the experiences of my neighbors, and thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much, Delegate. I appreciate you being here. Dr. Moretti, please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and honorable members of the committee for this invitation to speak with you today. As an emergency physician, I see the impacts of climate change on my patients every day, right now. However, the health consequences are so vast and varied that the role of climate change is often hidden. At times, the relationship is clear. For example, I treated a young man who suffered heat stress while working in construction. With his body temperature elevated to unsafe levels, he required rapid cooling through IV fluids. He suffered muscle breakdown and poisoned his kidney, requiring a hospital admission. But other times, this link is not as clear. Consider my 85-year-old patient who presented with a heart attack. It was only because of astute EMS providers that we were able to connect her heart attack to an overheated apartment that lacked air conditioning, coupled with her inability to leave. Climate change is a threat multiplier, with health impacts happening through many different pathways, such as temperature extremes, air pollution, or disruptions in supply chains. Climate change is also a threat magnifier, worsening chronic diseases such as heart disease and causing acute flares of other conditions such as asthma exacerbations. Because these effects are so widespread, it makes calculating the total magnitude of these impacts difficult. Therefore, the economic impacts are severely underestimated. Only easily quantifiable disasters and their infrastructure or crop damages are typically considered. Health-related costs are seldom, if ever, included in the math on climate change economic impacts. In addition, climate repercussions are not felt equally. When I come to work during a heat wave, I worry about the elderly. I worry about the blue-collared workers outside, and I worry about my pregnant patients unable to regulate their body temperatures. I worry about their unborn children, and as heat increases the risk of fetal death, premature labor, and long-term health problems after birth. Similarly, when I consider the potential effects of a hurricane in my home state, I worry about my patients that lack the resources to evacuate. I worry about my patients with disabilities that rely on electricity for their health, those that need breathing machines or dialysis. Notably, the patients that are most at risk are the same patients most likely to be on Medicaid or Medicare and least able to afford these costs. And while we may not know the total cost of climate change on health, we know they are immense and growing. Nearly every child in the world is at risk from one climate threat, and Medicaid covers almost 40% of children in the US. Children and infants have increased vulnerability to climate change. For example, smaller airways are more sensitive to swelling from air pollution. Children are at increased risk for mental and physical trauma from disasters, and they bear the consequences of these impacts for many more years to come. This spring, I have seen the same teen on multiple occasions for her asthma. On one visit, her breathing was so bad we needed to put her on a breathing machine, pushing air into her lungs. Her asthma is worsened by an extended pollen season, and her house close to the highway puts her at constant exposure to air pollution. Recently, there were brush fires in Western Rhode Island, and I expect to see her again in the emergency department. In the Medicare population, chronic conditions such as disabilities, increased vulnerability to climate change, age, and heart disease are risk factors alone. However, in addition, medications for chronic diseases can limit the body's ability to respond to heat stress. Mobility issues may limit access to cooling centers or safe evacuations during a disaster. Disruptions in infrastructure and supply chains limits these patients' ability to access the care they need to maintain their health. When we consider specific climate hazards, heat is often the first to come to mind. Where I live and work in Rhode Island, we are experiencing increasing use of pre-hospital resources, emergency visits, and mortality as summer temperatures rise, and these trends are nationwide. We also need to consider disruption in healthcare delivery. During COVID-19, I witnessed this firsthand. I cared for a patient, a young woman with COVID, who presented in decompensated diabetes because she could not access insulin. In the span of 4 hours, she went from speaking on the phone with her family to dead. I still think about her small children and how different their lives would have been if she had just had access to insulin. And these similar barriers have been documented for both Hurricane Katrina as well as Hurricane Harvey. These health complications are not only tragic, but they are costly. And we have only scratched the surface. Consider worsening vector-borne diseases, wildfires, droughts, food security. The impacts are broad, substantial, and worsening, and the economic impacts are immense. In 2008, the Congressional Budget Office presented this evaluation. For the federal government, rising healthcare costs constitute the principal challenge of fiscal policy. No other single factor will exert more influence over the long-term balance of the federal budget. In closing, I'd like to leave you with these two reiterated points. The economic toll of climate change health impacts are immense, but under-recognized and under-quantified. Medicaid and Medicare recipients will bear the brunt of these consequences. My patients depend on your action. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Now, Dr. Greenstone.
Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee for inviting me to testify today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about the temperature-related impacts of climate change on public health and our economy. The health impacts are likely to be some of the dominant costs of climate change. So what impacts will temperature changes due to climate change have on public health? This is a topic of some research of mine that was done with the Climate Impact Lab that I co-founded. It's a team of about 30 economists, climate scientists, and computational experts. The headline finding is that the projected mortality risks from temperature changes due to climate change are at least an order of magnitude larger than has previously been understood. This finding holds whether one uses a high emissions scenario that likely overstates the future growth of emissions or a moderate emissions scenario that likely understates it. As supported by recent work of the IPCC, the true impacts of climate change are likely to lie between the estimates based on these two emissions pathways. There are four main points that come out of my written testimony. First, global mortality risk is projected to increase by 85 deaths per 100,000 people by 2100 if the world is on the high emissions trajectory. This is larger than the current global mortality rate due to all infections and parasitic diseases. Under a moderate emissions trajectory, the increase in global mortality risk would remain significant at 14 deaths per 100,000, similar to the current global diabetes mortality rate. Some of this is illustrated in the slide that we put up here. Second, in the United States, the projected increase in mortality risk from higher temperatures under the high emission scenario is about 10 deaths per 100,000, about on par with the current fatality rate due to auto accidents. In contrast, this change, and I'm going to come back to this, is roughly zero under the moderate emission scenario, though this overall figure masks meaningful increases in some places and meaningful declines in others. I've included a table in my written testimony with data for each state under both scenarios to give a sense of the risks that your constituents face. There are also global and domestic maps of projected changes in mortality risks that are displayed here. But some examples might be instructive. In my hometown of Chicago, the mortality risk is projected to decline by about 35 to 40 deaths per 100,000 by 2100. Over time, we'll see fewer cold days, decreasing mortality risk during the winter, which will outweigh the risks of more hot days. However, other places will be harmed on net. Henrico County, Virginia, represented by Senators Warner and Kane, is projected to experience a higher mortality risk under both emission scenarios, about 35 under the high one and 17 under the moderate one. Johnson County, Kansas, represented by Senator Marshall, is projected to see an increase of 31 deaths per 100,000 under the high emissions one and about 11 under the moderate emissions ones. The third main finding, and this is important, is that the level of emissions is not a law of physics. It reflects policy choices to restrict emissions and technical advances that can also be influenced by policy. It's therefore useful to consider what policy might be able to accomplish or unlock in terms of benefits. An illustrative example is that a policy moving the world from the high emission scenario outlined on the graph there to the moderate emissions one would reduce the attendant global mortality risk by about 84% at the end of the century. In the United States, temperature-related mortality risk due to climate change would be eliminated by moving from the high to the moderate. The point is that robust climate policy offers the potential for some of the most significant public health gains in human history. Fourth, following the National Academy of Sciences 2017 recommendations, the Climate Impact Lab has developed new methods to estimate climate damages. A key output of these efforts is an estimate of the social cost of carbon, or SCC, which is the monetary cost of the damages caused by the release of an additional ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The SCC provides a value which can be used in cost-benefit analyses, regulatory policy, and for determining efficient prices for market-based policies, such as a carbon tax or cap-and-trade system. The CIL's approach produces an estimated SCC of $190 per metric ton. This means that every ton of CO2 abated reduces climate damages by $190. This use of frontier climate science and economics leads to a social cost of government significantly higher than either President Trump's estimate or President Obama's. Finally, in conclusion, given the scale of the climate challenge, I want to underscore that our nation would be well served to seek out the least expensive reductions in greenhouse gases. Markets have been shown time and time again to be the most successful tool to find these opportunities. This means that markets would allow us to confront the climate challenge without imposing unnecessary costs on American families. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much. May I turn now to Mr. Schellenberger? Sorry, Doctor. No, I'm sorry. I'm out of order. Dr. Schramm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Grassley, for inviting me to come and speak with you today. I am pleased to speak about the implications of climate change that may be imposed on the nation's public health. Much of my career has been devoted to studying healthcare costs, especially in the context of how these expenditures may or may not be proportionally related to improvements in the public health. In the interest of time, I'll skip over much of my biography, only to point out that the last time I was here, Mr. Grassley, I was running the Johns Hopkins Center for Hospital Finance and Management. I served on the faculty of the public health school there for 16 years. And then I left for a career basically all focused on healthcare policy, including managing the time insurance company, now known as Assurant, that's headquartered in Milwaukee. For the last few years, my research has been focused principally on the question of COVID and the performance of the Centers for Communicable Diseases. I've been a member of the COVID crisis group, and only yesterday we published our final report, which is called Lessons from the COVID War. At this very moment, the report is being revealed at the National Academy of Sciences. As the committee considers the question of public health implications of global warming, I want to emphasize two issues. First, the efforts to expand the idea of what public health is and why it is seen by many to be failing. As most of us would agree, the CDC, the nation's principal agency charged with protecting public health, failed to effectively control the COVID pandemic. I believe the principal reason is that both the CDC and the country's larger public health establishment, including the public health schools, reflect in part have expanded the scope and definition of public health such that its boundaries are nearly meaningless to the public. Consider that the CDC currently deals with a wide range of problems, but not encompassed by traditional definitions of public health, the science and art of preventing disease, prolonging life, and promoting health. Instead, the CDC deals with a long list of, quote, epidemics that are not related to communicable pathogens and cannot be corrected by traditional public health tools. Among these are epidemics of gun death, traffic fatalities, obesity, domestic violence, workplace accidents, and a long list of issues far distant from the traditional public health threats. In addition, we find the CDC working on problems that, again, cannot be solved by the traditional tools used to prevent the transmission of communicable disease. Two of the newest involve the CDC's attempt to ameliorate the, quote, social determinants of health and its commitment to promoting health equity. Simply, the CDC is the archetype of an agency beset by mission creep. Thus, even if global warming presented a clear and present danger to the health of every American, there is little that the CDC can do to mitigate such a threat. Among other things, the agency's managerial focus is so diffused, it is unlikely that it could effectively absorb another issue, particularly one in which the correlation between global warming and the public's health is so ambiguous. My research on the CDC budget suggests that only about 1 in 7 of its employees work or are engaged in traditional efforts to identify and control contagious pathogens. Far more CDC professionals work on international health issues that may or may not be related to protecting the U.S. population from communicable threats. Now, on the brighter side, I've included two charts, one that shows that we have continuously grown GDP rather extensively over the last 50 years since the passage of the Clean Air Act, and at the same time reduced virtually all of the noxious particulates that we breathe, showing that we can in fact grow the economy and make the entire society and our nation much healthier at the same time. Similarly important to global health and the argument that we are witnessing the implications of global warming on global health, I've included a chart that shows that over the last 50 years, we have been on a course of making virtually all of our GDP growth at much less fossil fuel burn. This is a huge achievement. It's an achievement of engineering, among other things. And this is a time to salute the engineers in public health that have brought us clean water, clean sanitation, and clean air. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shen. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Schellenberger. Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and committee members, thank you for requesting my testimony. I'm honored to be able to provide it. High per capita use of cheap and abundant energy is essential to lifting people out of poverty. There is no rich, low energy nation and no poor, high energy one. Adapting to higher temperatures requires cheap energy so people and nations can afford air conditioners, irrigation, desalination, and other technologies. The bottom line today is that cheap and abundant energy is the key to a better future, including reducing deaths from heat waves, disease, and pollution. The good news is that we know how to do this. Between 2005 and 2020, U.S. carbon emissions declined by 21.5%, which is 4.5 percentage points more than what the U.S. promised to reduce as part of the United Nations Paris Climate Agreement, and 4.5 percentage points more than what was promised under the 2009 Waxman-Markey cap-and-trade legislation. 61% of those reductions were due to the shift from coal to natural gas, and 39% came from intermittent renewables backed up by natural gas, which was required in most situations. The relationship goes in the opposite direction as well. Thanks to natural gas shortages and higher costs in 2021, coal-fired electricity increased 22% as compared to 2020. Carbon emissions are thus following the same trajectory as other air pollutants. As a result of cleaner burning coal, the transition to natural gas, cleaner vehicles, and other technological changes, developed nations have seen major improvements in air quality. Between 1980 and 2018, U.S. carbon monoxide levels decreased by 83%, lead by 99%, nitrogen dioxide by 61%, ozone by 31%, sulfur dioxide by 91%. While death rates from air pollution can rise with industrialization, they decline with higher incomes, better access to health care, and reductions in air pollution. Contrary to the assumptions of people who want to make energy more expensive, we move towards cleaner energy sources by making them cheaper and more abundant. Thanks to fracking, natural gas became cheap and abundant during the first decade of the century. The same has been the case with nuclear. France and other nations built large standardized nuclear plants, reducing the construction times and bringing the costs down. Better nutrition, better health care, more air conditioning massively outweigh climate change as factors determining health. Over a decade ago, the World Health Organization predicted the global burden of disease will have declined by 30% between 2004 and 2030, which is amazing news. And we are on track to do that. And said the WHO, quote, mortality rates will continue to fall in most countries so long as economic growth continues. In its report last year, IPCC noted, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change noted, that nations have adapted well to heat, thanks to, quote, heat warming systems, increased awareness, and improved quality of life. And that included particularly air conditioners. Quote, this is from the IPCC, evidence suggests a general decrease in the impact of heat on daily mortality, as well as, quote, a decline in the relative risk attributable to heat, unquote, and, quote, an increase in the minimum mortality temperature. We should be celebrating this. It's true there have been more heat waves in the United States since 1960, but what determines whether people die in heat waves is primarily whether they have air conditioning. Proof of this comes from the fact that heat-related deaths in the United States declined by between 50 and 75% since 1960, thanks almost entirely to air conditioning, even as heat waves grew in frequency, intensity, and length. Kind of amazing that I'm the first speaker to even mention that. I want to now point out something. This is profoundly misleading, and I want to explain why. This picture, this map, combines two things that the IPCC says not to combine. It's the shared socioeconomic pathway, 3, I'm going to need my glasses now to read the fine print, and RCP 8.5. Those two things are not supposed to be combined. Look, this is the IPCC combination of these two different scenarios, RCPs and SSPs. In SSP 3, there is no 8.5 combination because it's so implausible to have a situation of low economic growth and high emissions, unless you were somehow using all of your GDP to produce emissions deliberately, which is so ridiculous the IPCC doesn't conclude it. It's been stated that we're somehow between RCP 4.5 and 8.5. That's not what the IPCC says. This is their most recent report that came out last November. And you can see here, it shows that we're on track to be below RCP 4.5. So I think it's very misleading to suggest we're somehow between RCP 4.5 and 8.5. I will just end by saying I think we all agree that the future is not written, that we decide what will occur based on our actions. That means we need abundant natural gas to continue the transition away from coal, and we need a national nuclear power build-out based on what we did in the 1960s and 70s and based on what France, Sweden, and other nations have done since then. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Schellenberger, and to all the witnesses for your testimony. We now turn to questions from the committee. And as I've been asked to sit in as chair until Chairman Whitehouse returns, that means I get to ask my questions first. Dr. Moretti, take a deep breath because I'm going to tap into your experience and expertise here on a couple of topics. I want to discuss the increasing risks to the health and safety of workers who are exposed to dangerous heat conditions in the absence of adequate workplace protections. And despite Mr. Schellenberger's testimony, not all career paths enjoy the luxury of air conditioning. Farm workers are disproportionately at risk and die from heat-related illness at a rate 20 times greater than the average worker. That's why last session I co-led legislation with Senator Brown to direct OSHA to more swiftly establish a national standard to protect workers and ensure common sense workplace protections during extreme heat conditions. Farm work is just one example. A lot of times truck drivers, warehouse workers, others are exposed to extreme heat. This and other efforts to protect workers are critical policy components of climate adaptation. So, Doctor, as global temperatures continue to rise, what impacts should we expect to see on workers, and what additional steps can we take to protect vulnerable individuals, especially those in agriculture?
Thank you very much, Senator, for the question. I think you hit on a very important point, which is that there are certain populations that are very vulnerable, outdoor workers in particular. When they show up to the emergency department with heat stress or heat stroke, we treat them with IV fluids and we cool them down, but then we discharge them home, and they go home and they go back to work, and they're put at the same risk. The problem is that adaptation only gets us so far. We can only adapt to a certain level before those adaptation mechanisms start to fail us. And here is a prime example. The way that we protect those workers is that they don't work on really hot days where our bodies are not safe. That means they're not working. That means we're earning a wage, and it hurts our economy. So that's a severe limitation as our temperature starts to rise.
Yeah. And if you can just expand on that for a second, outside of mortality costs, that's what people tend to focus on. Can you just speak for a minute on the economic impacts or lost labor productivity as a result of unsafe working conditions?
Correct. So I don't have exact numbers, but I am happy to find them for you. But these are patients that I would tell not to work. I tell them not to work on certain heat days if possible. And I will tell you that there is a subset of my population that will not be able to listen to me, that will go to work regardless, and that will come back to the emergency department with the same problem I sent them out with. This is a huge, actually, example out west. I was speaking to a colleague of mine during the wildfires who was treating asthmatics as a revolving door. He would treat them, they would get better, he would send them back out into the smoke, and a day later, they would come back because he couldn't treat the underlying cause. He couldn't get to that root cause to treat them. So we, one, have increasing health costs because a lot of them are covered on Medicare and Medicaid. Two, we have their lost labor and they're unable to work out with sick days. And so we're losing economic drive on multiple fronts.
So you're such an expert, you anticipated my next question, which is this, extreme heat oftentimes leads to fire. Along with fire, we get a lot of smoke. And Californians in the fire-prone areas of the state are exposed to smoke for an average of about 3 months per year, resulting in poor health outcomes that you've begun to describe, in addition to the economic losses and a reduced quality of life. As climate change continues to increase the frequency and severity of wildfires, more and more communities beyond just the Western United States are impacted by these harmful effects. I know the last couple of years, I'll get occasional calls from colleagues in the Midwest complaining about the smoke emanating from large fires in California, even on the colleagues on the East Coast. A recent study in Nature suggests that wildfire particulate matter may be 10 times more harmful than other sources of pollution. So given that wildfires are only growing more extreme and frequent, how can we better mitigate the impact of smoke-related health risks for our underserved and rural communities that are often most at risk?
So we talk about mitigation and we talk about adaptation. To mitigate these risks, we need to mitigate climate change, and we need to limit our fossil fuel combustion in that which is emitted. As an adaptation mechanism, we need to identify these at-risk populations, and we need to start to put in public health policies that protect them, such as allowing them to be indoors with air conditioners when it's safe, air purifiers when PM 2.5 levels get to dangerous levels. But these treatments happen before they get to me in the emergency department.
Thank you very much. Senator Grassley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to read for Mr. Schellenberger 3 or 4 sentences from a July 2021 Wall Street Journal op-ed and ask if you can give a short answer that it's right or wrong from your point of view. Health deaths are actually a bigger problem than the news reports would suggest. Most heat deaths happen without a news crew to document them. Studies show that heat kills about 2,500 people every year in the United States and Canada. Each year, more than 100,000 people die from cold in the United States and 13,000 in Canada, which is more than 40 cold deaths for every heat death. On a worldwide basis, cold deaths vastly outnumber heat deaths. The last sentence says globally, every year, about 300,000 deaths are caused by heat, whereas about 1 7/10 million people die of cold.
Yes, sir, that's accurate.
Okay, then I was going to ask Dr. Greenstone a question, but I'm just going to make a statement about some testimony that he gave 2020 before the House Oversight Committee. He claimed that the mortality rate under a quote, unquote, high emission scenario will be 10 deaths per 100,000. Americans by 2100, similar to today's mortality rate from car accidents. The CDC recently published this graph for the 10 leading causes of death in America. And as you can see, each of the 10 deadliest public health conditions currently have mortality rates above your worst case scenario for climate change. Now, to Dr. Schramm, let me read you a few headlines of the past 6 months from the New York Times. Deaths from substance abuse rose sharply among older Americans in 2020. Following a 2-year decline, suicide rates rose again in 2021. Alcohol deaths claimed lives of working age Americans. These are real public health challenges. However, many on the left have become accustomed to labeling everything from sexism to gun violence to President Trump somehow as a public health challenge. So, Dr. Schramm, what sort of data framework or methodology should policymakers use to determine what is or is not a public health challenge?
Senator, thank you. I think perhaps the best way to approach this is to think about whether or not public health can intervene in those statistics. So, for example, the question of elderly drug abuse or substance abuse, how is that dealt with by the CDC or by public health officials? It's not clear that traditional methods of intervention, that is case finding and case tracking, can modify or mitigate this problem. The real issue has to go to denying our population these drugs. This is a huge issue, and that's where the real costs are imposed on the public budget. Secondly, it goes in the same direction for suicide. It's very difficult for the CDC to effectively mount a program that would reduce suicide. The tools of public health just don't go there. Suicide reflects much larger conditions in the society, some of which actually Dr. Moretti points to in terms of the implications of disease on emotional stability and emotional security. These are difficult issues, and they are really difficult when we consider them in the context of the federal budget, because we spend huge amounts of money needlessly and without any effect, and don't point to the issues that could really be changed if we could in fact mitigate these by the control of substances.
Thank you. Mr. Schellenberger, in your testimony, you say, quote, "Poor people and people of color are disproportionately impacted by climate policy restricting energy consumption," end of quote. Could you elaborate on how climate policies implemented in the name of disadvantaged groups often harm more than help such groups?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the main ways is just by making electricity more expensive, which makes it, which means that people use air conditioning less. And so one of the ways that people end up dying is that they can't afford to turn on the air conditioner, or they can't afford air conditioning. And so anything that makes electricity expensive is going to result in less air conditioning and higher deaths.
Thank you, Senator Johnson.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, Dr. Morietta, in your testimony, you said that the health consequences are so vast and varied that the role of climate change is often hidden. Then you go on to say, but sometimes the relationship to climate change is very clear. And then you talk about a construction worker who was overcome by heat. Well, I think it's very clear that that construction worker was overcome by heat, but as Mr. Schellenberger talked about, a heat wave that tops out 110, is it going to be that much more threatening than a heat wave that tops out at 109? And then you go on again, you've just made it seem like climate change is causing all these things with such certainty. It kind of amazes me. I'm not a climate change denier, I'm just not a climate change alarmist. You seem to be an alarmist.
I think that's because I've seen it. We've had 7 years in Rhode Island of worsening, record-setting heat. We know that temperatures are rising because of climate change. We know that the mean average...
But that's actually disputed, okay? I mean, I know you know it, but it's disputed. Let me ask you a question. Do you know how many deaths have been reported worldwide on the vaccine adverse reporting system related to the COVID-19 vaccine? Do you know how many worldwide deaths are reported?
I do not, Senator.
You should, but let me tell you, it's 35,152. Now, most people don't know that because it's been largely suppressed and censored. 8,743 of those deaths have occurred on either day of vaccination or within 1 or 2 days. That's 25% of those 35,000 deaths reported on VAERS associated with COVID-19 vaccines. Now, our federal health agencies who've not been honest and transparent with us, they've not made the correlation. As a doctor, I want to ask you, are you concerned when you weren't aware of those statistics, so I'm just giving them to you. Would you be concerned if there is any kind of drug intervention where you have reported to our federal health agencies 35,000 deaths and 25% of those occurring within 2 days of the administration of that drug? Would that concern you? Would that be something you'd want to investigate?
I would need to understand more about the statistics of where those numbers came from.
Okay, well...
But I do know that we're seeing rising temperatures in Rhode Island, increasing heat waves with increasing frequency, and increasing stress on the emergency department with worsened outcomes.
So no, I'm aware that all kinds of climate change alarmists are leaping to all kinds of conclusions to scare the you-know-what out of the American public, to spend trillions of dollars, money we don't have that are much better spent in other ways. Mr. Greenstone, I actually found that chart of yours somewhat comforting for at least America. When you take a look at the mortality risk, again, these are all projections. I don't put any stock in them whatsoever, but by your own projections throughout the United States, because of climate change, we're going to actually have a reduced risk of mortality overall in the United States. And wouldn't that really tie in with what the study from Lancet in 2021 said that we suffer about 600,000 deaths due to heat every year, but 4.5 million deaths because of cold. So in terms of excess deaths, a warming globe is actually beneficial. In my own state, your study shows that we'd have a reduction in mortality of somewhere between 54 and 56 people per, I guess it's 100,000. Why wouldn't we take comfort in that?
So thanks for the question, Senator Johnson. And what the work shows and the chart is that the effects of climate change are going to be very unequal. And absolutely, Wisconsin, Chicago, where I live, the reduction in cold days, the benefits from that will outweigh the damages from the hot days. But if you look more carefully at that, there's large swatches of the country where the damages will be much larger. And in fact,
but again, if you want to balance it all out globally, if you're trying to mitigate harm globally, isn't it true that the number of deaths, according to this Lancet study, the number of deaths caused by heat are 600,000 per year. Deaths caused by cold are 4.5 million annually. So the fact, in terms of global health, in terms of excess death, we're actually in a better position to prevent death by having the climate increase in temperature a little bit, right?
Senator, I'm not familiar with that study. What I am familiar with is my study. Your characterization of it is incorrect.
Well, your study is very favorable to my state. Our mortality declines by 54 per 100,000.
Wisconsin will benefit in terms of mortality. There are 49 other states in the United States. Many of them will suffer. Many of them will suffer more than Wisconsin will gain. And that is the nature of climate change. It's very unequal.
According to your study, you're concerned if you're in the really hot region of Africa, but in terms of the United States and most of Europe, we're in pretty good shape. We're all blue. We have reduced risk of death.
Yes, if you look carefully at the top of that figure, a large section of the country is not blue. Those are the areas where some of your colleagues represent people, and those people are going to face increased risk of mortality.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator. Delegate Smith, the effect you mentioned of the 3% increase in temperature, 3-degree increase in temperature in Maryland being exacerbated by urban heat islands. Do you have any rough quantification of how much beyond the 3 degrees the urban heat island effect can take a neighborhood?
Thank you so much for the question. So the city of Baltimore has, over the past century, seen a 3-degree increase, but that's larger than the average across Maryland as a state, and also it's about double the national average for the country. And so that's pretty alarming for the communities I represent, particularly because, as you've noted from some of the other testimony and responses, when you do not have a lot of green space nearby, it makes it very difficult to cool. Personally, when I lived at the top of my district, I did not have central AC. I was in another home almost 100 years old, but the trees were mature, there was grass all around, and I could just put a fan on and be relatively comfortable. But one of the things that makes row homes great in the winter is that they trap heat, which is good in the winter. However, in the summer, and now that I live in a row home, it can be incredibly hot. And these are communities, quite frankly, there's been research to show that the same communities that were impacted by redlining are disproportionately the overheated parts of a city presently that are experiencing their urban heat island effect, and my communities are no different from that. So communities that were redlined are less likely to have trees in them. And as many of us know, it takes a while for a community to get the full benefit of a tree, right? And so we need to make these investments yesterday. And I know that just in the past few years that we've seen tree plantings in my part of East Baltimore, you're seeing more comfort for those that are situated nearby. But quite frankly, if we do not simply provide more green attributes to communities like the ones I represent, you can have all the AC you want, but you're really not getting to the root of the problem. We can't be resilient and we can't reduce emissions if we're not looking at some new avenues.
And your constituents in urban heat islands are likely to turn where for healthcare, to federal programs?
Absolutely. As a city, approximately 60% of residents in Baltimore City are on Medicare or Medicaid, and particularly the communities that are closely situated near me in East Baltimore. These are some of the communities that have some of the lowest life expectancies in the city. So even though they have proximity to world-class healthcare at Johns Hopkins, it doesn't mean they always have access. And so yes, federal programs are instrumental and often under strain when extreme heat and other challenges present.
As we saw in Oregon and Washington, where they've had to actually revamp Medicaid programs to address with the risk after the heat waves out there, the deadly heat waves out there. Dr. Moretti, last summer was the hottest August on record in Rhode Island. How did that play out in your emergency room?
So, thank you, Senator, for the question. We're struggling. Healthcare is tenuous and has not recovered since COVID. I think that we saw how fragile our health system can be with COVID-19, and I am concerned as we continue to see more climate hazards to what this will do to the healthcare system. Last summer, the emergency department was full. My bosses were on local television asking patients to seek care elsewhere whenever possible because we were struggling to treat the patients that showed up to our door. We were seeing patients in waiting rooms. We were seeing patients in hallways. This was exacerbated by the heat, and it's worsened by poor staffing since COVID, and I am concerned what will happen as we continue to see increased climate hazards. In emergency medicine, we define a disaster as an event, such as a climate hazard, whatever it may be, that overcomes our resources. And right now, the healthcare system nationally is perpetually on the edge of a disaster.
There have been, roughly speaking, two ways that the reporting about health harms from heat have been quantified. One has been to look at the actual diagnosis or the cause of death report and pick out the causes that reference heat. Separate from that, in Rhode Island, by Brown University, as I recall, and also out in California and perhaps others, there have been studies that looked at the statistical coincidence of various morbidities and mortalities during heat wave events. And then looking at those additional deaths and illnesses and going back and seeing, could that be correlated? Could you talk a little bit about what that second round of inquiry has established? And then I'll turn to Senator Van Hollen, it looks like.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. So because heat impacts health through many different mechanisms, we cannot only look for heat stress or heat stroke within the medical records. Similarly, the patient I talked about who suffered heat stress working in construction, it's very likely that in his hospitalization, his diagnosis was coded as rhabdomyolysis and acute kidney injury with no mention of heat. So even as clinicians, when we know heat is playing a factor, it may not be coded correctly within the medical records. So when we do the second methodology that you're talking about, when we look at a population level and look for increases in hospitalizations over all diagnoses, we see much greater effects, up to 37% increase in visits, which is missed in that first mechanism of only pulling out diagnoses of heat illness and heat stress.
So the statistical method is more reliable.
It captures a larger patient population. However, that does not allow us to look at individual patient characteristics.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to be back. So Delegate Smith, I do want to follow up on some of the points you made in your testimony regarding the impact of climate change and how it's affected temperatures in Baltimore City and the heat islands that it's created. and measures that we can try to take to mitigate that, right? Even as we also try to address the overall issues. Can you speak to some of the issues the chairman raised? And I appreciate him talking at the outset about the House Republican plan that may be voted on this week, or that would essentially undo entirely the climate benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act, including investments in energy efficiency and providing rebates for homeowners to make their homes more energy efficient, which not only has air quality benefits, but also saves people in their pocketbooks. If you could just talk to the role of federal investments in trying to address some of the issues that you've raised.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. The investments that are in peril that you've highlighted are incredibly important to the people I represent. So you know that in many instances, seniors are overrepresented in the vulnerable groups that we've been discussing today as we, in regards to heat. And so having some of those energy efficiency rebates made available means so much to legacy residents that want to be able to age with dignity and comfort in the homes that they're living in. But also, in Baltimore City, it's the most transit-dependent part of the state of Maryland. So many people, roughly a third, do not have access to a vehicle. So the investments we're making in just infrastructure for it to be safer for pedestrians and bikers, those are also relevant to people I represent, because we want to ensure that we're doing things that allow people to move safely, but also reduce emissions that bring them harm. For my residents that have to stand at bus stops, it's going to be advantageous to have buses go by that are not emitting the same amount of pollution as others. So it's been critical to see the investments in green infrastructure and helping community-led initiatives around climate resilience that are going to also create jobs in community. So the same communities that are most exposed to the harm could also be at the forefront of the remedies. I know we have great organizations like the Baltimore Tree Trust, Civic Works, that are at the forefront of planting trees and also doing other installations related to climate resilience that the Inflation Reduction Act are making possible. And so I want to thank this body. It was a bipartisan effort that made that act possible, and it's going to have real benefits for the communities I represent and other communities across this country that bear a disproportionate burden because of heat exposure.
Thank you, Delegate Smith. So there have been a number of studies, obviously, that look into the health impacts of climate change. There was a study done by Johns Hopkins in our state of Maryland and MIT's Laboratory for Aviation and the Environment, indicating that Baltimore's asthma hospitalization rate is one of the highest in the country. And that the city's premature death rate due to air pollution is also one of the highest in the country. Dr. Morietta, can you discuss that link between climate change and how it acts as a threat multiplier and threat magnifier for communities like Baltimore?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. So we see climate change acting to impact our health through many different mechanisms. It's a threat multiplier in that regards. So increasing temperature in and of itself has increasing health harms, but at the same time, it increases levels of PM 2.5 and air pollution, which are toxic when we breathe them in and cause airway inflammation. Secondarily, we can see other effects as we see disasters that affect supply chains, disrupt healthcare systems, and those effects to health. We see decreased number of days for growing, and so we see increasing food insecurity globally as we're having increasing droughts. So through all of these different mechanisms, we see climate health impacts. However, certain populations are more at risk for these. And so we get risk upon risk upon risk for vulnerable populations. For example, heat is a risk. That heat risk is magnified in an urban heat island. At the same time, that urban heat island is next to a highway where you have increased air pollution and increased PM 2.5 levels. Moms were exposed to that level, which means they transmit that risk to baby who has an increased risk of asthma before birth. Then at birth, they live in an environment which augments this risk even further.
Thank you. I appreciate your testimony. Thank you all for being here.
I'm going to do a quick second round since I haven't had the chance to speak with all of the witnesses yet. Dr. Greenstone, your testimony, I believe, was that some of the dominant economic impacts from climate change occur in health costs. I observed the fossil fuel industry's latest strategy to argue that climate safety policies are too expensive, studiously ignoring the climate harm side of the balance sheet. What does your research say about the economic costs of ignoring climate harms?
Thank you for the question, Senator, and again for the invitation. So I do think it's worth saying that climate policy will have costs. There's no question about that. But what comes out of my research, as you were suggesting, is the other side of the ledger, the benefits. And what my latest research is indicating is that we had, and the U.S. government had been grossly understating the costs of, or the benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think a clear way to think about the problem is that every ton of CO2 that gets reduced, it will cost something, but it's going to generate benefits of $190 per ton. And we know from the operation of the RGGI greenhouse gas market along the Atlantic coast and in California, it's quite possible to get reductions in CO2 at much lower prices. So the price in RGGI is maybe $15, in California it's $20, $30. So you can get benefits that exceed cost by a factor of 6 or 7 to 1. That's kind of the bottom line from my research.
Thanks. And with respect to Dr. Moretti's observation about the difference between the two methods of determining health-related harms, do you agree that that's a cause of the understatement of the health harms?
I absolutely agree with Dr. Moretti. The evidence is very clear. The challenge, if you're trying to count up deaths from heat waves, is it's not written on the death certificate. And it doesn't just lead to premature mortality the day of the heat wave, but can take a couple days or even a week. And so you have to use statistical methods to add all that up. And that is why we end up with much larger numbers from this second approach.
You closed your comments with a affirmation of the importance of markets in making these decisions. You're also the Milton Friedman chair, I think is the right term. My recollection is that it was Milton Friedman's teaching that you didn't get a proper market signal if you didn't put the costs of pollution into the price of the product that was causing the pollution. Is that a correct layman's summary of the economics of market pricing and negative externalities?
Yeah, so Senator Whitehouse, you've far surpassed being a student at the University of Chicago, but that would certainly be an A at the University of Chicago. And I think the broader point, which I'd like to pick up on, is, which I actually found quite interesting in Mr. Schellenberger's testimony, is that he ended with a call for there to be a reliance on lower fossil fuel, energy sources at lower fossil fuels. And I want to connect it to your question. I personally don't believe in fairies, and I don't believe in unicorns, and I don't think rainbows happen just because you want them. And so in order to make the transition, there has to be, in a reliable way, there has to be a market signal exactly along the lines you suggested, Senator. And that will unleash the creativity and the entrepreneurialism of people in the energy industry and produce exactly what Mr. Schellenberger was asking for and lead to lower emissions, benefits at $190 per ton, and minimizing costs for American families.
Just to put a bit of a quantification out there, my recollection is that the latest study on the effective subsidy supporting fossil fuel consumption in the United States, which was performed by the International Monetary Fund, which I think you'll agree is a credible economic agency.
Yes, I do.
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe not an A like you, but A minus, we'll say.
Great. Is that the subsidy, the effective subsidy for fossil fuel runs to $660 billion just in the United States annually, and that the bulk of that subsidy comes from this point that we were talking about, which is that they get to pollute for free and don't have to put the cost of the harm, quantified in my opening statement at $800 billion per year in healthcare costs, into the cost of their product. And around here, there's an entire political party dedicated to protecting them as they pollute for free. I'll turn it back to Senator Johnson if he wishes to have another round, but before I do, let me just be clear. Does anyone on this panel contend that there is not a reliable correlation between carbon emissions and increase in global temperatures? 0 for 5. No one contends that. Okay. Senator Johnson, you want to take another round?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Greenstone, I have to admit, I was surprised you've done all this research and you weren't aware of that Lancet July 2021 article comparing deaths caused by heat versus cold. But let me give you another question here. In a previous hearing, I asked the witnesses whether they knew how much we'd already spent on climate change. You're saying there's a $6 or $7 benefit for every dollar spent. So first of all, do you know how much we've already spent combating climate change globally? Do you have an estimate for that?
I'm unaware of a reliable estimate, Senator.
Okay. Anybody here? I'll tell you, we had a witness that said it was about $5 trillion. So if your multiplier is accurate, we should have already seen about a $30 to $35 trillion economic benefit from that $5 trillion. By the way, in the Inflation Reduction Act here, supposedly we've got a little under $400 billion of energy credits and dollars going to what I would call green energy boondoggles. Goldman Sachs estimated that cost about $1.2 trillion. So we dramatically understate how much we're going to spend on this. What I would say a futile effort to try and hold back the tides. Dr. Schellenberger, I read your book, Apocalypse Never, and I don't want to summarize it for you, but I will. It seemed like you were making the point that economic progress and having a strong economy is probably the most important thing to concentrate on, in spending like $5 trillion to apparently have no impact on our environment because there's still, people still saying world's going to end in 12 years, is wasting limited resources. Does that pretty well typify your views?
Yeah, that's definitely one way of describing it. I think the way to think about this issue in general is around energy transitions. And we go from wood and dung to coal, hydro, oil and gas to nuclear. Each step along the way, those transitions are made by the new fuel becoming cheaper and more abundant than the older fuel. It's simply not the case that we got a transition from coal to natural gas by making coal expensive. We didn't have a carbon price. I mentioned that we did not pass Waxman-Markey cap and trade, and yet we reduced our emissions by almost 22%. That's the story everywhere in the world. So these economic models are very misleading in that sense. And just to make one other point here, the Chairman Whitehouse mentioned this IMF study. That is an absolute garbage study. And I assure you that Mr. Greenstone, I do not think that he agrees with that study. That study counted as a subsidy for fossil fuels the externalities of fossil fuels. It counted the externalities and relabeled them subsidies, and it did not count the benefits. So it was a cost analysis, not a cost-benefit analysis.
So let's talk about the costs of green energy. Let's talk about the cobalt mining in the Congo, utilizing child labor. Let's talk about the mining of other rare earth minerals. We don't even have close to enough currently to produce what's being envisioned. Can you just kind of speak to, I would call it the fantasy nature of what is being proposed right now and what's being imposed on our economy?
Absolutely. So the supply chains for renewables and batteries are a total human rights and environmental nightmare. Start in the Congo with cobalt mining, which is absolutely barbaric. Many people have seen the videos of people being buried alive. In China, the solar panels are being made predominantly by Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps. That's a part of China that the Biden administration says the Chinese government is committing genocide against the Uyghur Muslim minority there. That's how our solar panels are being made. The calculations on the carbon intensity of solar panels appear to be totally incorrect because they're based on a cleaner European grid rather than the coal-based China grid. So total nightmare. And then the other final problem with renewables is because sunlight and wind are energy dilute, it requires 300 to 800 times more land and significantly higher number of projects to produce the same amount of energy as you would from a nuclear or natural gas plant. That's why there's 8,000 solar, wind, and battery projects in the United States right now that are not hooked up to the grid because they can't get enough transmission because of all the different land use problems and regulatory and cost burdens associated with moving from energy dense to energy dilute fuels.
So I'm highly concerned about the corruption of scientific inquiries, scientific studies, because they're being funded by organizations, sometimes government, that know what they want in terms of result. Can you just kind of speak to the problem that we're experiencing in terms of, for example, scientific studies that can't be repeated?
Yeah.
The corruption, medical journals, these other scientific journals.
Absolutely. I mean, we need evidence-based policy making, not policy-based evidence making, and yet that's what we've seen here. And we've seen it with the IMF study, we've seen it in many other studies where people have an outcome in mind, like 100% renewables, and then they proceed along a course to do things like shutting down nuclear power plants, increasing carbon emissions, making electricity expensive, preventing poor people from having access to air conditioning. So you're absolutely right. We need to have evidence-based policy making, not policy-based evidence making.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Greenstein, you seem to be wanting to respond.
Oh, thank you, Senator. There's a lot to unpack here. I think I would just say I'll return to the peer-reviewed scientific literature that I participated in, and the evidence is quite clear that reducing carbon emissions, and I think Senator Johnson makes an important point. Climate change isn't going to just go away. It's a massive problem. The whole world is contributing to it. So if the test is, will X dollars cause climate change to forevermore disappear, that's the answer to always going to be no. But what the evidence is clear about is that policies that reduce emissions, there's wide berth for them to have benefits that are many times larger than their costs. And I think that's God grant me the wisdom, no difference between the things I can control and the things I can't. The things I can control, or the things that the United States can control, are its emissions. And those reductions in those emissions have the potential to be one of the largest public health benefits in human history, and have the potential to have benefits that would vastly exceed their costs.
Thank you. Mr. Schellenberg, first, thanks for being here. It seems that there are some areas where you and I agree, so let's start with your assertion that climate change is happening. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, and I think we also agree on the importance of nuclear energy, so I would like to acknowledge that agreement as well.
And you believe that humans are contributing to climate change?
Oh, absolutely.
Through carbon emissions?
I have for 30 years, sir.
And to quote you, the cause of climate change is rising energy consumption using fossil fuels, correct?
Yes, correct.
And you also argue in your testimony that, quote, it would be best for global temperatures to remain stable.
Yeah.
And that's because there are risks and dangers associated with rising temperatures globally?
Really any change. There'd be risks with global cooling as well.
Yeah, but that's not the risk we're presently facing, is it?
Correct.
With respect to the IPCC, do you consider their work to be solid and reliable?
Yeah, absolutely. For the most part, and I rely almost entirely on it.
You claim that renewable energy is always expensive. One of your critiques is its cost. Yet I repeatedly see studies that renewable energy is now less expensive, less costly than various fossil fuel sources. And that comparison showing clean energy to be less expensive does not even take into account the question of the negative externalities. Are you sure that it is true that renewable energy is always expensive compared to fossil fuel?
So my claim is that intermittent renewables, excluding hydro, make electricity expensive. But let me ask you, sir, If solar and wind are so much cheaper than existing energy, why did the Congress approve $370 billion to subsidize solar and wind?
I would argue because it's such a tiny fraction to give it half a chance against the $660 billion subsidy for fossil fuel.
But it's already cheaper,
And I
then why would you need
argue
any
that
subsidy?
It's pretty basic economics that negative externalities belong in the price and therefore are a subsidy, everything from Milton Friedman to the IPCC to the IMF. So you and I are just going to have to disagree on that. Okay. You have expressed skepticism about the relationship between climate change and various extreme weather events.
Skepticism wouldn't be the word I would use.
What word would you use? I want to make sure I say it right.
Evidence-based. I mean, every statement I've made is either in the IPCC or peer-reviewed scientific literature. So it depends on the extreme weather you're talking about.
So you have former colleagues and collaborators who are actual climate scientists, which you are not, who have said some things about these claims of yours. Zeke Housefather, with
He's
whom
never
you
been a
worked
colleague of
at
mine.
the Breakthrough you worked with him at the Breakthrough Institute, did you not?
He was never a colleague of mine.
Okay.
Breakthrough Institute.
He wrote, Schellenberger's claims that climate plays no role in natural disasters and wildfires fly in the face of a large peer-reviewed scientific literature showing clear links between climate change and extreme heat events, drought, and extreme rainfall, as well as links between hotter and drier conditions and wildfire areas burned in many regions of the world. And Kerry Emanuel, a professor at MIT who provided you a blurb for your book, wrote, the cleanest way to look at climate effects on natural phenomena is to look at the phenomena themselves. Here, there is strong and mounting evidence that climate change is increasing precipitation extremes, floods and droughts, conditions for wildfires, and the incidence of strong hurricanes. Whichever way one looks at it, Schellenberger's statement is not defensible. So,
Do I have time to respond, or are you not going to let me?
no, I'll give you a minute to respond.
Okay, so first of all, Tom Wigley, the co-founder of climate science modeling, called Apocalypse Never perhaps the best environmental book ever written. Kerry Emanuel, as you mentioned, also blurbed the book, and I've been working with James Hansen to save nuclear power plants around the world for the last several years.
No,
in
nobody's
terms of,
saying you're
in
wrong
terms
about
of
everything.
natural
Just
disaster,
that you're wrong about that.
there's a single source of data on natural disasters globally called the MDAT data center in Belgium. It shows natural disasters going down over the last 22 years. Do you know why that is? It's because what we classify as disaster is costs and deaths, and those have been going down because human resilience has been going up. So the conflation of extreme weather and natural disasters is extremely misleading. Yes, I agree with more heat waves, greater temperature extremes, greater precipitation, absolutely. But no increase in landfalling hurricanes in the United States. Anybody who claims different is lying to you.
But is that truly the measure when you count the actual harm from the hurricanes? Like
Yeah,
wind
because
speed
when
and
you
rainfall,
factor in
aren't those the things that matter?
more wealth and more people in harm's way, you do not see an increase. In fact, we're seeing a
Do you
decline.
factor in increased rainfall and increased wind
Yeah,
speed?
absolutely. I mean, look, there's a single source of
Do
data
you?
on it. You can check it yourself. I'm sorry, what was the question?
Do you factor in increased rainfall and increased wind speed in your analysis?
It's not my research. There's only one. I mean, and we're looking at landfalling hurricanes. Is that what we're talking about? It's flat. Okay, so it's not like there's multiple studies. There's just counting landfalling. And the best studies by NOAA. NOAA predicts
But you
that
keep changing the subject back to landfalling hurricanes.
What do you
I
want to
had
talk
asked
about,
you
sir?
about increased precipitation from those hurricanes and increased wind speed. With more wind speed and more precipitation, you get more damage, even if it were correct.
No,
with the
not if
same
you have
number of
rising
rainfalls.
resilience, you don't, sir. In other words, and if you look at NOAA, they predict 5% increase in intensity of hurricanes, 25% decline in frequency, both of which are predictable by the physics. It's not really a debate, but I agree, we will see more precipitation because of climate change.
Correct. Senator Kane. Saved by the bell.
This is one of these days where I have made 4 committee hearings between 9:30 and 11:45, and when I do that, my staff rewards me by allowing me to start tomorrow at 6:45 a.m. instead of 6:30. But I'm sorry that I've missed the entire discussion. I'm very, very interested in this topic, and I guess maybe...
On that subject, Senator Kane, if you don't mind, I will I have another
Oh,
I need to
okay.
get to. If you don't mind closing us out, we have the closing materials.
That's what I'll do.
Finish your questioning, and then we're ready to go.
I just
Well, I do get another round here, correct, Mr. Chairman?
yes. You did. Yeah.
No, you've had three now. I'm going to have get another round of question, especially after you badgered our witness. We'll talk a little bit of reality when I get around to it.
These three documents to the record.
You will get more questions, and out of delusions of grandeur, I've decided to move up the dais to take advantage of Sheldon Whitehouse's departure. Virginia is a state that really sees a lot of climate effects, and it's interesting that over my time in public life, the dialogue in Virginia has gone from likely effects in the near future to today. And the two areas of the state that are seeing it the most, but not only these two areas of the state, are the Hampton Roads area, which is so vulnerable to sea level rise, and the Appalachian area, which because of the narrowness of the valleys is really vulnerable to intense flooding. The rainfall in some of these areas in Virginia is not changing over time. You can look at annual rainfall, it's not changing very much. But it's just being produced in fewer extreme storms, and the infrastructure that we have, schools, roads, and healthcare infrastructure, frankly, in a part of the state where people often have less access to infrastructure, including healthcare, the infrastructure just isn't suited for it. I think there has already been some testimony from Delegate Smith about this issue of urban heat islands. I live in the city of Richmond, and we're a pretty green city compared to many, but in terms of tree cover. But I wonder if, as we look to the future in your experience, what more can local, state, and federal agencies do together to deal with this heat island issue, which would have a whole range of health effects on people's livelihoods?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. And actually, there's been a lot of coverage about Richmond and Baltimore specifically in the heat and rising heat and temperatures. And so I know that there are pockets of both cities that have great tree canopy, right? Yep. But there are still parts that are lagging far behind. And I want to lift up. I know you're just coming into the hearing right now, but I think we've talked a lot about the seriousness of premature death because of heat. Yep. But I think we need to lift up the fact that quality of life. Sometimes people are merely surviving, they're not thriving. And I think that as policymakers, we don't want people to simply be existing in our jurisdictions and states. We want them to be living their optimal life. And so what heat islands can really mean in an urban context is if you already have a pre-existing condition like asthma, who wants to have more asthma attacks than you need to because you're constantly being triggered, right? And we also know for families of school-age children, asthma is the #1 reason for chronic absenteeism from schools, right? And so as we have rising temperatures, there's not just an impact to the mother or father or the guardian's ability to work in a healthy manner. There's also implications for the young people in the home to be able to thrive as students and learners in the community. So some of the things that we can do at the local and state and federal level with strategic investments is improve tree canopy, also painting roofs white. Sometimes these are simple things we could be doing to reduce the absorption of heat into some of these areas of the city. And then also, I know that there's a lot of conversation about where do you put solar energy, right? Mm-hmm. And so one of the bills I was successful in passing was really just reducing some of the tax implications for using the unusable parking decks, other compromised land, yep. And installing solar.
Rooftop spaces.
Absolutely,
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the nice thing about these is they can help you on the health side, but they also are income producers. Somebody with a parking deck that has a roof that's not being used and can do solar. Somebody can paint a roof white. They're going to find that it not only might that have a positive health effect, it would have effect on the utility bills as well. Dr. Murray, I want to ask you about one topic, and then I'm going to come to Senator Johnson. As I interact with young people, and I've stopped just thinking of myself like a young person when I got a Medicare card 6 weeks ago. And when I interact with young people, there is a palpable sense of anxiety among many, dread, fear, kind of an existential one. We had Earth Day was Saturday, and I noticed that I live in Richmond, the large public university, Virginia Commonwealth University, had a very sizable student Earth Day activism. And, we have these every year. And I see the messaging, and might be pro-recycling messaging, but I see some of the messaging getting more and more distraught and more anxious. We're living in an anxious time. COVID was tough. You know, young people in particular, I think, have had a challenging last few years. It's been a time of isolation, COVID, and that's not good for young people or seniors. But talk a little bit about mental health impacts as we're talking about COVID effects on healthcare. I want to make sure we give enough attention to mental health issues, and particularly mental health issues with young people. So what are you seeing in your practice?
So we're seeing, thank you, Senator, for the question, and I think you've done a very nice summary of how people feel and how young people feel. We're seeing rising depression and rising anxiety levels in our youth, in our teens, and I think that this is multifactorial. I think, as you pointed out, COVID has had a huge impact, and I think that climate change and this recognition of climate change, concerns about the future, add a baseline depression and anxiety to our population. But similarly, as we've talked about today, climate change acts through many different mechanisms. So we have this baseline concern about climate change and rising overall mean temperatures, but on top of that, we have mental health outcomes from disasters, so wildfires, hurricanes, etc.
Shootings.
That augments this. And we also see increasing depression and suicide attempts with heat waves and temperature. So there's a physiologic link between these changes as well. So we're seeing changes in mental health through many different mechanisms.
And before I turn to Senator Johnson, I guess the other thing I would say is, while there are challenges, there are also some upside opportunities in the mental health space, being involved as part of solutions, knowing that there are some solutions you can do in your own house, in your own neighborhood. Being able to take part in solutions can have a positive impact on mental health, because people don't just feel hopeless and that it's beyond them. They believe that they, in fact, can have a hand in solving it. And in Virginia, we've seen this in a significant way. We were never a big producer of alternative energy, low and no carbon energy. Coal, yes. Natural gas, yes. But we were bottom 10 solar and no wind compared to other states. And so when we talked about climate in Virginia, we tended to talk about what I led with, which was the challenges of climate change. Now we've moved into the top quarter in the nation in deployment of solar, and we are going to be the East Coast Center of Excellence for offshore wind. And that is producing not only some jobs, it's also producing a little bit of a positive, kind of can-do attitude. We're not just a climate change problem child, we're also going to be an innovator. It's going to help not only Virginians, but others. And there's a positive mental health side to being a problem solver in something like this. I will yield to Senator Johnson and note that I do not believe I badgered any witness.
I appreciate that. Here's one proposed solution, by the way, if you want to decrease the stress level on our children. It'd be nice if climate change alarmists would stop scaring the you-know-what out of our children by telling them that the world is going to end in a dozen years, okay? It's not. But let's talk about some realities. Does anybody here expect either India or China to quit trying to bring their people out of poverty and stop using fossil fuels? And anybody here think that's going to happen? Does anybody dispute that by their own models, if we were to eliminate all CO2 in America, it would have a negligible impact on global temperatures? Anybody want to dispute that one? Can somebody explain to me, I look at just some basic facts. Again, I don't deny climate change, I'm just not an alarmist. I look at the Vostok ice core sample, and I see we're in the 5th cycle now. Very, very consistent, 22.7 degree temperature variations over the span of 440,000 years. The Greenland ice core sample, the number of them, about 6.7 degrees over the last 10 to 20,000 years since the last glaciation period. This is the one that always shocks audience. It shocked me because we're always concerned about sea level rise, right? The increase in the sea level in the Bay of San Francisco since that last glaciation period, 390 feet. So any of our witnesses think that there's anything mankind could do or could have done to hold back the tides? The answer is no, there's nothing we could have done. So again, like Bjorn Lombard talks about, is we have limited resources. Dr. Schramm talked about, we've been very effective at reducing some of these noxious pollutants that obviously impact health. Spend money on that. Spend money on cheaper energy, nuclear, right? I totally agree. But the environmental left generally has shut down nuclear plants. So if you're really concerned about CO2, and I'm not, I think it's a plant food, we'll adapt, but there's far better ways of spending money. Mr. Schellenberg, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that the nuclear issue just shows that maybe the people that are raising the alarm about this, there's an ulterior motive going on here. Something else is going on. I mean, we've got some big problems with renewables that we need to deal with. I mean, we have Steve Hayes from NOAA, who is top scientist at NOAA, that said that you can't have any more industrialization of the eastern seaboard without threatening the extinction of the North Atlantic right whale. It's extremely troubling. We're seeing a high number of dolphin and whale strandings, beachings since industrial wind activity occurred. So, I know that many people here support nuclear power, but we still don't have a plan to expand it. And that's the easiest and fastest way to transition away from fossil fuels without increasing electricity prices.
What big wind towers are ever repaired and put back in service? And what is the life of one of these wind towers? And how much copper goes into them? And what do we do with them? Again, we were just ignoring. There was a really good hearing. I saw a clip of it talking about these large trucks need 2 batteries, each weigh 8,000 pounds.
Absolutely. I mean, we talk about the externalities of fossil fuels, but what about the externalities of renewables? It's not like you can put solar panels on the compost bin and hope that they'll, decompose. There is no end of use for solar panels. Europeans dump them on African nations. For ours, go to landfills. Same thing with used wind turbine blades. It's because it's not cost effective to recycle them. So you have a huge waste problem from these solar panel and wind turbines and batteries that nobody's talking about.
So, Dr. Greenstone, that would be a really good analysis for your research. Is take a look at the externalities and the cost of all this green energy, what's being proposed. Have you looked at that?
It's an excellent question. And I think one thing that I'm a little confused about the exchange with Mr. Schellenberger here is the planet doesn't care if we run solar, if we run wind, or nuclear for that matter. The planet only cares about CO2. So I think that's why many people interested in climate, certainly including myself, advocate for a market-based solution that penalizes the release of CO2 that is causing damages. So I find the debate about particular technologies a little confusing. And then I just want to add one point where I feel like there should be some agreement with Mr. Schellenberger and I, but I'm a little perplexed by it. He seems to be a big proponent of nuclear and was engaged in a kind of heated exchange with Senator Whitehouse. Well, if solar and wind are so great, the market would just adopt them. The same challenge applies to the advocacy of nuclear. Nuclear plants aren't running, they're not being built because they're out of the money. The reason they're out of the money is they cost more than fossil fuels, and so fossil fuels have this kind of free subsidy. So I just come back to, we should aim for a level playing field that does not treat any technology better than the other, and stay focused on what the planet cares about, and that's CO2. It's not a particular technology.
Well, nuclear, we kind of regulated up the cost of that. Was Ms. Schellenberg, I think you should be able to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, look, the planet does care. If you use 300 to 800 times more land for producing energy from solar and wind than you do out of nuclear, the planet does care. The North Atlantic right whales do care about that. If you produce solar panels in China with coal, those are high carbon intensive solar panels. In contrast, if you made them in a place and you made them in France, which is mostly nuclear. So of course it matters. So and as nuclear, as you mentioned, I mean, California was shutting down a nuclear plant, not because it was expensive, but because of anti-nuclear phobias that date back to the 60s. So nuclear is fundamentally just an issue of public concern. We over-regulated it. The people that pushed for that over-regulation were pushing for it because they were ostensibly scared of it, but they really favored renewables. There's a whole regulatory paradigm here that has to be taken into consideration.
And what about the economic or the environmental impact of mining?
Massive. I mean, that's why you look at what's happening in the Congo. I mean, just go online and look at cobalt mining in the Congo. It's a shame. What's happening in China, it's an absolute travesty. We should not be importing any more solar panels or batteries produced in China to the United States. It's just a fundamental human rights issue.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I'll just conclude when I have a Republican witness who suddenly seems to be against all of the above, I'm curious, and to have a Republican witness take up for the whales First time in my career in public life where someone has done that. So I'm assuming it's a road to Damascus experience. I come from.
I've actually been a conservationist my entire life. So
Great, that's
with all
great.
due respect.
That's great. I'm from a state that's 35% nuclear, probably double what the national average is. We're perfectly fine with it. Helps us with climate, and we're really proud to be producing more battery-powered heavy-duty trucks than any state in the country, and doing offshore wind and growing in solar. Look, American innovation is, again, rocketing us forward on clean energy. That's such an exciting thing. It's creating jobs, creating opportunities, going to lead to a cleaner planet, going to lead to better health care, and that's exciting. We have policy challenges we have to work out around regulations, statutes, tax incentives, et cetera. But I kind of go back to Dr. Greenstone. We're probably approaching a point where we could, within a few years, the histories of subsidies of one form of industry over another, we may be nearing the end of that, and we may be able to just have complete even playing field on energy, removing all subsidies and tax breaks, and as you say, let innovation in the market drive where we go. I have a pretty strong feeling if that were to happen where we would go. Well, I want to thank the witnesses for appearing before the committee. Full written statements will be included. As information for all senators, questions for the record would be due by noon tomorrow, with signed hard copies delivered to the committee clerk in Dirksen 624. Email copies also accepted. We ask witnesses to respond to questions for the record, if there are, within 7 days of receipt. With no further business of the committee, the hearing is adjourned.